The Huguenot Museum. I'm Clarissa Levi, Art and Heritage Counsel at Wedlake Bell.
And I'm Richard Harwood. I'm a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers.
And we're joined this morning by Dr. Tessa Murdoch, Vice Chair of the Acceptance in Lieu panel of Arts Council England and Chair of Trustees of the Huguenot Museum in Rochester. Thank you for joining us, Tessa. And we're so pleased to have you here to talk about the Huguenot Museum and wondered if you might start by describing your career path so far.
Of course. Well, I was lucky enough to read a joint honours degree at University College, London, in English literature and history of art. And I was taught by extraordinary luminaries, ranging from Stephen Spender, A.S. Byatt, and art historians that included John White, who was expert on the frescoes at Assisi, through to Helen Weston, who was a brilliant art historian focusing on French 18th and 19th century. And I crossed paths with, now sadly, the late David Beinman, who was a great expert on 18th century British art and sculpture. And he encouraged me to continue my studies for a doctorate, which he was keen to supervise. And I was keen to concentrate on the work of the sculptor Louis-François Roubiliac, who came from Lyon and the 30 major years of his career was spent in Britain, and his work is astonishing. However, David was very keen to do his sort of magnum opus on Roubiliac. And so he sent me away saying, Tessa, why were there so many French artists and craftsmen working in London at the same time as Roubiliac? And so I went home and I remembered that my mother's family had Huguenot ancestors. And there was an individual by the name of Edward Feline, or Feline, who was a silversmith, who had been apprenticed to Augustin Courtauld, sort of second generation of that Huguenot family, which is perhaps the best known of any Huguenot family who settled and established in this country. And my maternal grandmother would give me the task of putting candles in these silver candlesticks that we had inherited, made by Feline, for special family events, dinners, Christmas, that sort of thing. And so my mind went back to that and I thought, oh, yes, Huguenots, that's who they were. And so I registered to do a PhD on that subject, which I completed in 1982. And that actually was my entry to the museum profession, because I got a permanent job at the Museum of London with the initial task of researching and preparing an exhibition which was called The Quiet Conquest, the Huguenots, 1685 to 1985. So it was marking the tercentenary of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which was Louis XIV, as it were, cancelling the Edict of Nantes that his grandfather, Henri IV, had signed in 1598. So basically outlawing Protestantism in France. And at that stage, some 50,000 or more Protestant refugees settled in the British Isles, but they also settled all over Northern Europe, and they went as far afield as South Africa and North America. So they created the sort of diaspora that is familiar to us today from, the 1930s, and indeed more recently with refugees from Ukraine. So it's an extraordinary rich subject which remains incredibly pertinent to our time. Refugees, discuss.
So what's the origin of the Huguenots? They're French Protestants?
They're French Protestants. They're followers of John Calvin. They really start to form a coherent minority in mid-16th century France. And in fact, the first Huguenot church in this country is founded through a charter of the Protestant Edward VI in 1550. And it's here in the heart of the City of London in Threadneedle Street. So for those who were escaping to the British Isles in the late 17th century, they were joining already established communities of Huguenots, not just in London, but all along the southeast coast, in East Anglia, and as far afield as Edinburgh. And of course, they also went on to Ireland, to Dublin, to Cork, to Waterford. and beyond.
And there was a history of religious conflict in France in the 16th, 17th century. One of the earliest Doctor Who stories was about the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Eve in 1572 in Paris.
Right. Thank you for reminding me. I'd forgotten that Doctor Who was there.
Yeah. So something that occasionally gets sort of picked up in sort of the English knowledge of history, but so the conflict, and then was the Huguenots expelled or did they flee?
They were actually forbidden from leaving. The ministers were encouraged, in fact, were expected to leave within 24 hours of the edict being signed. But Louis XIV was convinced that he could force conversion. And if they were caught leaving, they were sentenced, the men, to a lifetime's penal servitude on the galleys. So galley slaves, white slaves in the Mediterranean, discuss. And the women and children over 7 were confined to convents and forced to convert. So I think it was the fear of losing their children, which was the motivator. But it was only really a tiny percentage of the Protestants in France who actually left. Most abjured their faith and hung on to their estates, and you could once again qualify as in professional careers such as law and medicine, from which they were barred as Protestants and continued to be barred right through the 18th century until Louis XVI signed an Edict of Toleration in 1787.
Does that partially explain why there is such a rich history of crafts and makers among the Huguenots?
I think so. And there were particular crafts that were kind of regarded as being of gentry status. So interestingly, in the 16th century, that includes glassmaking, which was a focus particularly in the Lorraine area. So there are many glassmakers who came to England and to Ireland in that period. And through the 17th century, goldsmiths particularly, and there were a particular regional centres where the goldsmiths dominated the local guilds. So many Huguenot goldsmiths came from Rouen and settled in London, or Blois. And I think in some areas, I think it was Blois, if the Catholic Church needed sacred silver, they were forced to commission it from Protestant craftsmen because there were not Catholic craftsmen in the guild. They'd probably been excluded by the Protestant mafia, if you like. So, it works both ways. And we think how Catholics were being persecuted here in penal times. It's an area I'm very much interested in too. We can understand at first hand how devastating it was. And I think one of the most hideous aspects was the billeting of Catholic troops on Protestant households. It's known as the dragonnade, and it gets underway in the early 1680s. And the stories of abuse of families being eaten out of house and home. And at the Huguenot Museum, one of our prize exhibits is a Geneva Bible that was apparently hidden from the Catholic troops that were billeted on this particular Huguenot family home by being hidden ostensibly in a loaf of bread. I kind of worry that if the bread had been baked, the smell of the bread would have been so enticing for the troops that they would have cut into it. So I think it may have been hidden in dough and put on one side. I think that's more practical, but it certainly had water damage. And it is a sort of magnetic exhibit in our opening galleries at Rochester.
So that brings us to the Huguenot Museum. Can you tell us how that came about and talk to us about the French hospital?
Yes. So it was the vision of the then deputy governor of the French hospital, Peter Duval, whose family have been involved with the French hospital for a couple of 100 years. In fact, the Duval family are extraordinary. They were really the Fabergé of the 18th century. They were court goldsmiths and jewellers with premises in Geneva, in London, and most significantly in St. Petersburg. So they made gold boxes and gold-framed miniatures for Catherine the Great to present to her international diplomats who were clustering around her court. Anyway, that was their sort of great moment. But Peter has a really enhanced view of Huguenot heritage. And in fact, in 2009, I was co-author of a book on the French hospital in England, its history and collections, with the late Randolph Vine. And I think that made the board of the French hospital realise that their extraordinary collection of portraits of directors of the charity, a charity that was founded in 1708, had interest beyond the walls of the charity. And so they bought a building in the centre of Rochester High Street, in fact, in December 2010. And originally, I think they were planning to include residential homes for elderly people of Huguenot descent, which is the purpose of the French hospital. Today, it's an almshouse. In the early 18th century, it provided shelter for people of Huguenot origin who could no longer earn a living. And they even catered for those suffering with mental health problems.
So this is more hospital in the sort of one of the medieval senses of an almshouse, like St Cross Hospital in Winchester.
Yes, but they were treating mental health difficulties, which at that stage in London, there were no other serious facilities for that. And there was a resident physician. And people were recommended for entry through their doctor or apothecary. So the archives of the French hospital, an amazing record of the network of medical profession in London in the 18th century. So that's how the museum came about. It opened in 2015. It was opened by Princess Alexandra. And first 5 years went very well. I mean, we had, I think, 3 changes of directors for personal reasons on their part. And along came COVID. So the museum had to shut for 2 years. And Peter Duval, who was chair of trustees, and I joined the board as a trustee in, I think, 2013. But Peter caught COVID and very nearly died. He was in intensive care. And as a result, has lost the use of his right leg. So he's now in a wheelchair. So I was really the only trustee in, where are we, November 2021, who had the capacity, I'd just left the V&A after 30 years there, to step into his shoes as acting chair. And I did that for a couple of years and was elected substantive chair last October. But the challenge of restructuring the museum with just one full-time member of staff, and it's very much dependent on volunteers. And we have several volunteers who are residents of the French hospital. So there's very good sort of intergenerational spread. But then we have another challenge which emerged last year, because we're in a building that was partly leased to Medway Council, and they provided a visitor information centre, which was on the ground floor. And they decided to close that in April last year and rescind their lease with the French hospital. So the ground floor was empty. The Huguenot Museum is on the first and second floor. And in order to maintain access to the Huguenot Museum, we had to employ more part-time staff for security and, just ready to keep the museum open. So we were fortunate in applying to the Heritage Lottery Fund for a resilience grant. They had supported the setting up and opening of the museum. And they were very keen that the museum didn't fail at this stage. So that has made a huge difference. And we were awarded that in September 23. So it's Huguenot Museum, A New Future. And that runs through to April next year. And that's given us the opportunity to revisit our status. And we have just established now that we are in a position to make an offer to purchase the building from the French hospital. So we will need to launch a fundraising campaign, and we will need to take advice from the Lottery Fund. But we have an exciting vision to create a craft making centre around the museum with support from major City of London livery companies and working in collaboration with the King's Foundation and hopefully a rather remarkable organisation which is based in Bloomsbury and in Deptford, Cockpit Arts. So creating workshops for emerging creatives who've just come out of college will often benefit from bursaries from some of the livery companies that are relevant, but also creating an opportunity to attract apprentices to work with these young creatives. But also, as we roll out our learning programme again from the Huguenot Museum, to bring this alternate route to the attention of school parties. So the idea of the importance of hand skills. And it seems that this is particularly appropriate at a time when the list of endangered crafts is growing and AI obviously is threatening to take over in so many fields, and emphasizing the importance of those human hand skills and manufacturing, when I think there's a real demand for that. I suppose the challenge is to create a really flourishing market for handmade jewellery, silver, weaving, bookbinding, and also conservation, which is something the Huguenot Museum has been very involved in. And I'm sort of motivated also because I have worked as a silversmith, I've registered my own mark, and I understand the satisfaction of that creative act, actually.
So might that then be the use of the ground floor of the building? The making will happen there.
Well, we're very fortunate in having attracted the interest of John Simpson, who's a leading architect who's worked with the King's Foundation. He actually designed the King's Gallery at Buckingham Palace. So he has already produced designs for up to 40 workshops, which will not just be on the ground floor, but there is various spaces on the second floor and first floor, which have been retained by the French hospital. And there are a series of flat roofs. There's an additional building out the back. The building was originally owned by the local gas board and built by them in the 1930s. So it's got a sort of neo-Georgian colonnade entrance, which I think would be preserved because obviously the High Street is a conservation area. But there's a lot of scope for developing the back extension, which is flat-roofed. So John's come up with a brilliant plan with sort of mezzanine windows and so on, which I think would work very well indeed. But we have an exciting meeting coming up later this month with John showing the plans to the trustees of Cockpit Arts. And from then, I hope all good things will flow.
I mean, what you describe is such a vibrant and thriving hub and not just a museum. And it makes me think that it owes a lot to, clearly owes a lot to its success and the knowledge and the capacity and ability to apply for a resilience grant and come up with all these ideas and make these things happen. It all comes down to the people that are involved, and the role of the trustee, your role in all this, I find fascinating because, for a museum to thrive in the way that the Huguenot Museum clearly is, they need to have people who have the energy and enthusiasm that you have and have all these ideas. So what would you say that the benefits are for trustees of being trustees? It's clear enough what the benefits are for museums.
Yes. Well, I suppose one of the challenges that I faced was refreshing the board of trustees and how to attract the appropriate new trustees with the necessary range of skills. And some of that was achieved through word of mouth. I even advertised on LinkedIn, which was extremely successful and attracted 3 new trustees, all of whom I'd had personal connections with. There was one who had been a scholar at Yale with me 10 years ago. 2 others had crossed my path at the V&A, either as a fellow colleague or a student on the V&A RCA course. So that immediately resulted in a very healthy kind of age range. One is a senior curator at Leeds Castle. Another was a research development manager, then working for the British Library, who now works for the Courtauld Institute. And the third was much younger. And so, suddenly we had trustees in their 30s, 40s and 50s, whereas previously we'd all been at least in our 60s. And I think I very much encouraged that age range because I found I was appointed a trustee of, in fact, a Huguenot-founded Idlewild Trust in the early noughties. And I was still full-time at the V&A. But I learnt so much from being a trustee about reading reports of organisations that were applying for funding. Now, today, the Idlewild supports conservation and early performing careers. So you name it, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of organisations in an objective way is a brilliant method to develop that objectivity in relation to one's own particular calling, was it a museum curator, whatever. It gave me that wider horizon. And I'm thrilled, actually, that we've just attracted, as trustee, in fact, as secretary of the board, Peter Duval's granddaughter, Brani Duval Fryer, who is actually reading for the bar. And she's in her late 20s. And she is passionate about seeing the Huguenot Museum flourish. So, she has a sort of double qualification. Obviously, she's got legal qualifications developing fast, but she also is a member of the Duval family.
That personal connection.
Yeah.
So you're clearly beautifully supportive of young people becoming involved as trustees, but also I'm interested to hear about, you described apprentices at the Huguenot Museum.
Well, in March 2023, we launched a Friends organisation. We actually held a performance at Toynbee Hall in Spitalfields of Huguenot refugee stories. And we even persuaded an actor with a proper Huguenot name, Bert Portal, to read the escape story of Isaac Minette, who crossed in a small boat from Calais to Dover in July 1686, and arrived safely at the White Cliffs on the 1st of August and kept that date as a fast day until the end of his life. He died here in 1745. So that was a sellout, actually. I think holding it in Spitalfields, we received funding from the Rothschild Foundation to work with the Spitalfields Trust. And I think, collaborating is a really important way forward for a small independent museum. We launched our Friends of the Museum on that occasion, and we set up 3 different categories, and we named them initially as Master, Journeyman, and Apprentice. We had the historical novelist and philanthropist, I suppose, Kate Moss, join, and she insisted, of course, on being a mistress. So we had to make sure that we had journeywomen as well. But the apprentice membership is for children between the age of 6 and young people of 17. And we just request one £10 payment to cover that membership, to encourage younger people to engage with the museum. And we have 7 apprentices signed up at the moment, 7 and growing. And 3 of them, in fact, are the grandchildren of the former president of the Huguenot Society of Great Britain and Ireland, and very articulate. Another is the daughter of the curator of Baroque sculpture at the V&A. So we had a really magical event last summer when Kira d'Albuquerque, the curator at the V&A, and her mother, who's the member of the Huguenot Four family in Bordeaux, and her 8-year-old daughter, Eloise, discussed their own family doll's house. And Eloise told her mother and grandmother of all the additional works that were needed to complete the doll's house. And we hosted this event because in February 2024, we opened a new exhibition of a historic Huguenot doll's house created in 1730s for a teenager, Sarah Letouillet. We believe that she was given this doll's house to prepare her for life as a chatelaine of a great house. And 10 years later, she married into the English landed gentry. She married Sir Matthew Featherstone. And she took her doll's house with her to that marriage. They had a great house on the site of the Scotland office in Whitehall and a country estate near Petersfield, Up Park, which of course today is the property of the National Trust. And I had a colleague from the V&A who was the curator responsible for National Trust South East. We met at a private view of Pallen House in Chichester, and Becky Wallace said to me, "Tessa, would the Huguenot Museum be interested in showing the Up Park Doll's House?" So I thought this was a perfect opportunity. And the Lottery Fund Resilience Grant met, you kind of knew this was happening when we applied for that grant, met the cost of installing that, which is actually not much change for 30,000 by the time you've created appropriate interpretation. And we had to build an additional wall. But it looks really wonderful in the Huguenot Museum. I encourage people to come and see it. The loan's been extended for a further year. And it coincided with a period when Up Park was closed to the public because you probably remember there was a catastrophic fire there in August 89. And actually, it was a miracle that the Doll's House survived. And the reason it survived was that it was made over to the Treasury in 1965 on the death of Admiral Mead, who was then head of the family, and then transferred from the Treasury to the National Trust in 1985. So if it had remained in family ownership, it would have been in their private apartment on the first floor. And tragically, the family lost everything during that fire. So the fact it was on the ground floor was really thanks to the acceptance in lieu system, which kind of brings us round to my role on that panel, because I feel passionately about the opportunity for acceptance in lieu and indeed cultural gift, lifetime giving, which is of tremendous benefit to museums across the country, but particularly to regional independent museums.
And so the Doll's House is with you really as a result, an indirect result of the acceptance in lieu scheme. And there are other objects, I believe, as well at the Huguenot Museum, which have come to be shared with the public through the AIL scheme. Are there any other projects or future exhibitions that you're looking to beyond the Doll's House?
Well, we have been in discussion with Diageo. It sounds unlikely, but one of their most profitable labels is Tanqueray Gin.
Right.
Tanqueray is a Huguenot name. And in 2018, we collaborated with the V&A to acquire one of a pair of silver double-lipped sauce boats by Anne Tanqueray. She was born Guillaume. Her father was a first-generation Huguenot goldsmith from Metz. She dutifully married her father's apprentice, David Tanqueray, and on his death, she took over the business and registered her own mark. Anne Tanqueray's great-grandson, Charles Tanqueray, invented Tanqueray gin in Bloomsbury in 1830. So we thought an exhibition on gin and silver, that way round, sponsored by Diageo, maybe with a sandwich between the gin and the silver being the Church of England, because David Guillaume, within his lifetime, he had premises in Pall Mall. He made silver for royal family in the court, but he also ran banking services and had made a healthy profit. Bought a manor house in Tinggrith, Bedfordshire, very close to the Woburn estate. His son married into the Dimmock family. The Dimmock family, traditionally king's champions, charge into Westminster Hall to greet the newly crowned monarch. And David Guillaume Jr. became, I think, Lord Lieutenant of the county of Bedfordshire. So in one generation, that family were more than assimilated, and subsequent generations were rectors of the local church, St. Nicholas in Tinggrith. Interestingly, one of our latest trustees, Venetia Tanqueray, is a direct descendant and happens to live in Medway Towns. And she helps with our family history research. So we get increasing number of inquiries of people thinking that their name is Huguenot or they've got Huguenot ancestry and wanting that to be researched on their behalf, for which we make a modest charge. So actually our takings from family history have doubled since Venetia has joined us. So I know Diageo aren't doing terribly well financially at the moment, so we need to plug this. The lady we were negotiating with is currently on maternity leave. So we're hoping that she returns and we can develop this.
It's a wonderful insight to the sort of web of connections that you come up with as a trustee, and your involvement with the Huguenot Museum is to me completely fascinating because you're right, I absolutely wouldn't have guessed any of those. But how wonderful. I can't wait for this all to come to fruition.
Well, I hope that you will come and visit if you're so fascinated.
I can't wait. So I suppose I'm always interested to know, what's been your favourite thing about your involvement with the Huguenot Museum? What's been your favourite moment?
Well, I think the most remarkable aspect is working with the people who are running the museum and actually recruiting an operations manager for the museum was not easy because it was really a fresh start after COVID and the climate looked quite gloomy. And we found a remarkable individual who'd been in adult education and had also worked for education in prisons. And Lara Dix has exhibited the most amazing tenacity also in developing the team of volunteers and part-time employees. So we now number a crew on the ground of about 20. And there's a remarkable sense of commitment and team membership, which I think is the absolute key. And so when people go to the Huguenot Museum, they're very warmly welcomed, and people remember that. And there is time for them to share their Huguenot stories. And I think that is really the most remarkable aspect of the museum, that we can make time to talk to people, to make sure that their visit is memorable, not just from seeing the increasingly extraordinary things that we have on display. And, recently we've been given a whole collection of documented Spitalfield silks by Cora Ginsberg, who's a leading antique dealer in textiles in New York. We have on loan a spectacular salver made by Augustine Courtauld, engraved with the coat of arms of the de Thuillier family, so it absolutely links with the Doll's House. That's from a leading silver dealer in New York. So part of that is the network that I built up at the V&A. But as well as these extraordinary exhibits, we've got an amazing collection of Huguenot watches, a long case clock that was given by a Huguenot maker to the French hospital for the courtroom so that the directors would get one for their own homes, in a form of advertisement. But people love to talk about their reactions to these exhibits, and we are there to listen. And I think that's incredibly important.
Well, how wonderful. Thank you so much for talking to us today about the Huguenot Museum, Tessa. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Art and Heritage Law Contested Heritage. Please do follow or subscribe on Apple or Spotify podcasts to enjoy more shows.
We have a new podcast out every fortnight. If you're able, please take the time to rate us and put down a review.
The show is also on the 39 Essex Chambers website, along with podcast series on topics such as artificial intelligence, climate change and planning.